What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our World War II notes. Yesterday, we had started it up, did some background on Japanese history, kind of what was going on over there, just a quick overview, and talked about kind of how they're different culturally from us. One thing I forgot to mention, I used essentially the same cover slide for the notes yesterday. This Japan builds an empire. And I forgot to mention one thing I wanted to point out to you. And this would be something that would be good to add into your notes as we get rolling with that today. Here is an image of the Japanese flag. Sometimes you see it depicted this way. Other times you don't see those rays coming off, all the red bars there. What is that? Any guess? If you think, oh, that looks like the sun, you're spot on. Actually, Japan used the image of the rising sun to represent them. That's still to this day their flag, but it has been for quite a while. And specifically, this is one thing I'd want you to put in your notes too. Japan uses the rising sun to represent itself. Now, why would it be the rising sun specifically and not just like the sun in general or the setting sun? Well, think of it. I'm going to show you some more maps coming up, but if you look at like a globe or a big world map, Asia is the largest continent on the map, right? That big landmass there. Japan is a chain of islands, like 4 kind of big-ish size or medium-sized islands, and then about 1,000 other tiny little islands. And it's all the way on the far east coast, or right off the far east coast of Asia. So it's often been called, or is known as the land of the rising sun, because think the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. So since Asia is kind of like the main world landmass, and Africa and Europe are kind of connected to it as well, it's basically like you go as far as you possibly can to the east and then actually get off the continent and go onto the Japanese islands. And if you were out in like Tokyo Harbor, which is on the east side, kind of the Pacific side of Japan, I think every morning you'll have a spectacular sunrise coming up over the Pacific Ocean. So it's kind of like that's where the sun rises, right, from history. So that is, for good reason, an image that Japan has always chosen to represent itself. So that's something I'd want you to have in the notes, and hint, that might be on the quiz or the exam down the road. And then don't be confused. Sometimes you'll see the flag where it doesn't have the rays of sunlight coming off. I just like the one with the rays, so that was what I chose to put on here. But often you'll just see it where it's a big red, rising sun on the back of a total, back white backdrop that the flag would be. All right, so here we go. Part 2 of Japan building an empire and kind of the origins of World War II out in the Pacific. Now, this is part 2, like I said, so if you hadn't seen part 1, I'd recommend you go back and watch that first. And then just like how we covered the intro to the war in Europe with a 3-part lecture series, I think this one's going to end up being a 3-part lecture series too. So this is kind of the middle part here, and I have, I think, 2 slides worth of info that I'm going to get out to you today. Come on, there we go. Oh, maybe 3 slides. I forgot this one that I threw in last minute. I had spoke about it a little bit yesterday, just how Japan is very culturally different, how we kind of have a disconnect in America, where in a lot of ways we can relate to the Germans, even though we might not agree with the Nazi party at all or think they're evil. We can culturally relate to Germany or France or England pretty well, and it doesn't really matter what race you are, whether you're black or Asian or white, Native American, whatever the case may be. If you've been born in America and lived here your whole life, America is kind of we're very diverse, but it's a European-based culture, right? Most people here speak English. We use that European alphabet. Just a lot of our traditions and stuff and cultural things, Santa Claus and all that, it has its roots in European culture. So we connect to that pretty well and are often kind of sort of on the same page with European countries, even if they do speak a different language. With Japan, we have a huge disconnect because they are just culturally totally different, not necessarily in a good way or a bad way, but very, very different mindset, different culture than America. And I wanted to emphasize, this is a really key thing that I want you to put into your notes, because this is going to come into play and really kind of shock Americans as the war eventually unfolds and we get into this conflict with Japan, that Japan is totally an honor culture. That is I said, what makes them tick? If there is one thing that is of the most supreme importance in Japan, and I think as far as I know, this is still really true today because culture will survive wars. But throughout Japanese history, honor is a huge thing. What do I mean by honor? Honor, they look at it as like doing your duty, doing the right thing. So like on the small, like micro scale in a family, it would be like honoring your father, honoring your parents, doing what they wish and respecting them. That would be a very important thing. On a broader, like macro scale, Japanese people feel a strong sense of honor, at least most of them do, to doing what the emperor, he's the guy on top of the totem pole, what he says, carrying out his wishes. You're going to honor your country. And if you were like, say, a draft dodger, or you, another thing, if you surrender in battle, even if it's a hopeless battle, it's seen as you dishonored the Empire of Japan. You dishonored your whole family by surrendering or becoming a POW. They see it as, if you're out in a conflict, if you're fighting in a war, even if it becomes hopeless, the Japanese soldiers are expected to fight to the death. And you know, in America and in Germany, sometimes the government will say that you fight to the last man. Like Hitler, I used as an example yesterday. He gives the order at the very end of the war that all Germans are supposed to resist the Allied armies, and we are fighting to the very last man. But you know what? Most of the German people, even guys in the German military, except for the really hardcore Nazi fanatics, most of them disregard that. And they are like, yeah, this, the country's collapsing. We're going to live to, see another day. But in Japan, that is not the case. And we'll get into this more as the war unfolds. But man, when the order goes out that they're going to fight to the last man, they absolutely do it. And it's really very few Japanese guys kind of break away from that groupthink and say, well, I'm not going to fight to the death. Most of them are very willing to do that honorable thing and give their life for their country. So make sure you know that, just have a description of it in your own words, what honor means. And I want you to know that honor is like the most supremely important thing in Japanese culture. And that leads to kind of a disconnect and America and Japan just kind of not getting each other and not seeing eye to eye through this war and the events that are leading up to it. So Japan now, another little heading I'll have you put in there is something to the effect of they're looking for a fight. All right. Remember, America forced Japan, or maybe not forced, but persuaded Japan to open its ports in the 1850s because it had been isolated for most of its very long storied history. They realized how far behind they were. Remember, I was talking about how they were still fighting with like katana blades and samurai swords and literally armor and stuff in the mid 1800s, when most of the big armies of the world, by that time, they're using, rifles and bullets and, revolvers and things like that. Japan saw how far behind they were, and they began to modernize really quickly. But even though they modernize and they create a kind of like European or American style army in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and by the way, they do a great job at it. Like they have a top-notch military and navy. Even though they do that, they still hold on to a lot of their cultural stuff. Like, for example, most of the officers, they still had samurai swords. Now, they often weren't going out and fighting with those samurai swords in battle against the enemy, but they would still carry them. They, like I said, honor is everything in their culture. So when they defeat enemies on the battlefield, they absolutely, a very key point is this last one I have on here, they treat the people they conquered absolutely ruthlessly. Now, why do they do that? Is it just because they're mean? Well, I think the Japanese leadership at the time was kind of mean. That's part of the answer, but that's not all of it. It's when they look at enemies that they're fighting on the battlefield, and some of the guys, the Americans, and we're going to get into some stories of American soldiers that early in the war surrendered and become POWs, prisoners of war. That's a good term for you to have too. POW is a prisoner of war. They see those American soldiers as dishonorable. It's like they have no respect for these guys because they're like, if these guys had any honor, if they were an honorable enemy, and we're fighting, they would actually respect enemies that they're fighting, but they felt like they couldn't respect somebody that's dishonorable. So for a soldier to not fight to the death, to surrender and not fight to the last man, they looked at him as dishonorable. And then once you're dishonorable, then all bets are off. They could treat you like like dirt, man. They treat you horribly. And a lot of our guys go through just horrific experiences in POW camps. And it's not just American soldiers either. It's also the Chinese and the Koreans and these other peoples in Asia that look similar to the Japanese and have similar cultures. But Japan, when they go in and conquer them, and these people, like they just kind of surrender because they want to keep living their lives. Japan sees them as dishonorable, and that justifies all the horrible atrocities that they carry out on them. Now, a lot of attention is paid to the Holocaust in Europe, what the Nazis did to the Jews, as it should be. That's a really horrific but important part of history, and we're going to cover that more down the road. But something that sometimes gets overlooked is what the Japanese did to the peoples they conquered, which it's not, I would say more people died in the European theater of the war as a result of what the Nazis and the Soviets were doing and kind of what was going on out on the Eastern Front over there. And that would wrap in like casualties in the Holocaust and all that. But almost as many people die in Asia, in the Pacific theater of the war, because Japan literally starves to death millions of Chinese people. They also go in and do just like horrific rapings and very grisly stuff where they're cutting people's heads off and making examples of them. Often, like this image I have in the top corner here, this is a Chinese prisoner that they had captured, and they view him as dishonorable. So they line him up in front of other prisoners, and one of the officers is going to go literally chop his head right off in front of them. So those samurai blades, they still get some use and stuff, but it's more for like, I guess more flash appeal and ceremony and that kind of stuff. But the Japanese, I just want to emphasize that and make sure you put something in your notes that they were ruthless. They were right on par with what the Nazis did in Europe. But a lot of times, and I've heard this said before, in American history classes, traditionally, we don't pay quite as much attention to that because maybe for racial reasons, that the people that the Japanese were killing were in large part other Oriental Asian peoples, whereas the people Hitler were killing, the Jews, well, Jews are essentially, even though Hitler wouldn't view it that way, Jews are white people. Most people would just view a Jew as another white person with a different religion. Now, I'm not saying that is the case. I'm covering it here, and I am going to go through quite a few stories of how rotten the Japanese were to the people that they treated. But that's something that you should have in your notes, and we're going to get into that in more detail coming up. Anyway, Japan also feels like after World War I went over this, how they felt like they had been disrespected when the Treaty of Versailles was getting signed. That was the treaty that ended World War I. And remember, Japan was on our side in World War I. They fought with the Allies. But then when they were kind of like their representatives, when the treaty was being negotiated, the Japanese guys were pushed off into the corner. They didn't really talk to them. There is the language barrier and stuff, but they were really kind of disrespected. And I've heard it described that they said they felt like they were treated like little children. All right. So Japan feels like it has something to prove. It has a chip on its shoulder, and leading up to World War II, they very much have like a chip on their shoulder, and they're trying to prove something. They're trying to get respect on the world stage, okay? Now, I'm kind of going through these, I guess, out of order, but another thing I'd like you to put in your notes is that first bullet point, and I want you to know a key point, something that'll be on the quiz, is that leading up to World War II, before World War II breaks out, Japan actually got in a series of different wars. Most notably, they defeated about 10 years apart. This was kind of in like right at the end of the 1800s and then early in the 1900s, they defeated Russia and China both in battle. Now, why is that significant? Well, Japan is kind of a medium-sized country. It's a chain of islands, all right? China, as you're probably all aware, is a massive country. It's at least 10 times the size, land-wise, probably about 30 times the size of Japan or more land-wise, and a much, much bigger population too. So for Japan to actually go in and in a ground war defeat a Chinese army, in battle, well, that's like David killing Goliath. That's like a little guy beating up a guy that's 5 times his size, right? So a pretty impressive thing there. But it didn't get that war between Japan and China, the early wars that happened there, didn't get a whole lot of attention in America or in Europe because it was an Asian country fighting an Asian country, and the European powers in America, that's kind of off their radar. Whatever, who cares? They're kind of looked at like they're fighting over the scraps. You know what I mean? The European countries had their big empires, and who cares when two smaller Asian countries fight each other, or actually a big country and a little one. The Russia one, I would underline that or emphasize it a little bit. That one does catch world attention because here's an important thing about that conflict. When Japan defeats Russia, and this was mostly a naval battle, but also there were some small ground battles too, that is the first time in modern history. That's really the first and most notable time since the Industrial Revolution started up. So kind of like late 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution started. That's the first time that basically a non-white country, or, in this case, an Asian country here, Japan, defeats a white country. The Russians are about as white as it gets. They live up in, most of the Russian population is kind of in the northern and eastern part of Europe. That was the first time like a white country had been defeated by a non-white country out on the battlefield in modern times. Everybody just assumed, because Europe had the Industrial Revolution kind of first and had the best technology, best guns, best cannons, that basically European or American armies were going to be just unstoppable on the battlefield. Well, Japan learned from that, and they made a kind of Western style military, and they were really good and effective with it. And then if you remember back to like when this war happened, it was actually right before World War I. Think, how did the Russians perform in World War I? They're a huge country. They have a massive army, but man, they were backwards and very incompetent and not well prepared and horrible tactics. So actually, when that war breaks out between Russia and Japan, it is very lopsided. Even though the Russians have more soldiers and actually have more ships, the Japanese ships are way, way better. And the Japanese soldiers on the battlefield are far more disciplined and much more well-trained. So it ends up being a total massacre for the Russians, where pretty much half the Russian Navy gets sank in one battle. And then guess who stepped in and actually brokered a peace deal in that war between Russia and Japan? It was actually none other than Teddy Roosevelt, my favorite president, right? It was during his presidency that played out, and he went in and kind of intervened and said, hey guys, let's chill out. And he was able to broker a peace deal. But if the rest of the Russian Navy had gotten over there to support the half that was like getting attacked and by that point sunk, probably all that would have happened was the whole Russian Navy would have gotten sunk. And this, when Russia gets decisively beaten by Japan, it's not like they conquer all of Russia or take it over, but they beat them and they take some land from them. That's shocking to a lot of European countries, because now it's like, hey, man, still Japan is very much underestimated and doesn't get a lot of respect, but they're starting to catch people's eyes, and it would have been much wiser if the European countries and America had actually taken Japan far more seriously, because they end up, as we're going to see, putting quite a hurting on us and put up a really good fight during World War II. All right, last slide I'm going to get through today. I want you to know kind of a key thing, because Japan is becoming a strong nation by this time in the lead up to World War II. We're saying like 1920s and 1930s. But they're definitely not like the preeminent power in the world. Way more people in the late 1930s are scared of Nazi Germany and looking at them like they're a force to be reckoned with. Really, in America, even though we end up fighting on the side of Russia, we look at Russia as our enemies, as the Soviet Union, like they're bad guys. It's a communist country, right? Anyway, we're preoccupied with a couple things. First off, I don't know, do I have it on this side? Basically, the reason no European countries, and I'm talking about like Great Britain and France, because they both had global empires. They had them leading up to World War I, and then they win in World War I, and they actually add a little more territory to their empires. They potentially could have gone over and put Japan in check, use their navies and their pretty well-trained armies to put Japan in check. America could have too, because America was seen as, the British have the biggest navy in the world. This is a key thing for you to know and maybe put in your notes. The British have the biggest navy at this time. America is number two, but during World War II, our Navy is going to get bigger and go to number one. And Japan had the third biggest Navy in the world, actually, and a very high quality one, too. America was seen as the dominant power in the Pacific Ocean. America could have went out there and probably put Japan in check too, as they're doing horrible, rotten things to the Chinese, Koreans, beat up on the Russians, and they're starting to build a big territorial empire. But nobody did that because this first point here, remember, there is a worldwide depression going on. Americans are very much preoccupied with our bad economy. Like, I'm talking about the era of like the movie Cinderella Man, where guys, like Jim Braddock are struggling just to put food on the table. And most Americans want no part of like playing politics and foreign wars or anything. They're much more concerned about what's going on right here in front of them and having a job and making ends meet and taking care of our country. The same is true in Great Britain and France. And on top of that, Great Britain and France are right next to Nazi Germany, and this Hitler guy's taken over there, and that's the devil right next to you. They're focused on him because, man, as they should be. And even though Britain and France have colonies way out in the Pacific Ocean, as America did too, it wasn't seen as an imminent threat to us. It was like, yeah, maybe if Japan gets out of line, they might take a colony here or there, and we'll go to war with them, and we can beat Japan anytime. But it wasn't seen as like a threat to the homeland, like that they could invade us or invade anywhere in Europe. And they're probably correct in that assessment, but unfortunately, that led to a situation where nobody was putting Japan in check, and the Japanese empire grows and grows and grows in this time, and they become kind of progressively more ruthless. Now, what's Japan's ultimate goal? I have this underlined here. This is something you want to have in your notes, and it will be on the quiz. Hitler, his ultimate goal was to become the dominant power on planet Earth. Hitler basically wants to take over the world. Now, he's going to start with Europe and most of Asia and take out the Soviet Union, but his long-term game plan was Germany is going to be the dominant power on planet Earth, okay? The Japanese didn't have such grand ambitions, all right? Now, what was their end game? They really wanted to be the dominant power in East Asia. So key part there. And like the Orient would be another way of saying it, the Oriental, portion of Asia. So they basically wanted to take out China and Korea, their closest neighbors. They wanted to have a chain of islands, and they wanted basically like half of the Pacific Ocean or so, East Asia. East Asia and I guess it would be West Pacific. Now, America was the biggest power out in the Pacific, and we had islands right over next to them. Remember in the Spanish-American War that I had covered, we had taken the Philippines and Guam. So we have some colonies right over there in their backyard. Anyway, Japan doesn't feel like it's ever would be able to take out America or it's going to be able to dominate the whole Pacific. And they actually talk to America and try to cut deals. They try to say, hey, more or less, to sum it up, they're saying, why don't you take your half of the Pacific Ocean and you can kind of be the big dog over there and run things and we won't mess with you. Just let us have our big territorial empire over here on the far side of the Pacific. Now, America, we don't really like that plan because just like we knew Hitler was kind of a bad guy and was saying a lot of rotten stuff, we've heard stories coming out of China and Korea, and we know the Japanese government is ruthless, and they're also a fascist power, just like Italy and Germany was. So those are the three fascist powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, that make up the Axis power alliance, all right? Japan also, here's why they wanted to have a territorial empire there. There aren't many natural resources in Japan, okay? Japan on its own, it's 4 big islands and 1,000 tiny little islands. This chain of islands that they have, that's their homeland, has almost no natural resources there. They don't have precious minerals, and most importantly, they don't have oil. And what do you need to run a modern day empire and to be a strong, respected country? Well, more than any other resource, you probably need oil and you need refineries. You need to make diesel fuel to run your big ships, your tanks, your planes. diesel fuel and gasoline. They have to have those things, and they don't have access to it. So they figure if they can build up this empire out in the East Asia, like West Pacific area, and I'll show you a map of that in a minute so it'll make more sense. There are some islands to the south of them, the Dutch East Indies, which is like modern day Indonesia, that do have oil. So if they could take those as part of it, and then they could build a couple refineries of their own now, and then with taking land in China, like a lot of farmland, now they could be a self-sufficient, self-sustaining empire. So that's their goal, to have this little bubble of land over there in that part of the world where they have all of the resources they need, and they will be a self-sustaining empire that doesn't have to rely on anybody else. Now, up to this point, in the lead up to World War II, they were not self-sustaining. They had not taken those islands with oil. And America doesn't like what they're doing because they're a fascist country, which is opposite to the American ideology. And we know they're being ruthless and mean to all the peoples that they've conquered. So America also, though, at the same time, we're preoccupied with the Depression. And we have no interest in going to war and picking a fight with Japan. So we try to use like diplomacy, and we try to do some backdoor things to like put them in check without actually having to fight them. This is a very key point, and this is what leads up to the Pearl Harbor attack. The U.S. says, Japan, you need to withdraw from China and Korea. You need to stop threatening other countries. And until you do that, we will not sell you one drop of oil. Okay? Specifically, it wasn't even crude oil. We wouldn't sell them refined fuel. So here's another little tidbit that I'd like you to put in your notes. Even though America didn't have the biggest oil reserves on planet Earth, we were at this time really the only country that had refineries. So oil that's getting pumped out of the Middle East or Venezuela or other places that have big oil deposits, it would all get shipped to America on massive cargo ships. It would go down to like the Gulf Coast. These refineries, I think, are in Louisiana, a few different spots in the country. The crude oil comes in, they refine it and turn it into gasoline or diesel fuel, and then America ships it back out and disperses it. We sell it to other places around the world. Many, many countries were reliant on U.S. oil, on the United States processing that and selling it out to everybody. When we cut Japan off, here's another very key fact I want you to put in. Japan has 18 months worth of oil stockpiled. Now, exactly how many barrels that is, I couldn't tell you. But basically, when we cut off the oil supply, they have 18 months left where they can keep operating their equipment. And then if they don't find a new flow of oil coming in, nobody's going to have to defeat them on the battlefield. Their empire is just going to collapse because they can't operate any of their equipment. So when America cuts off that oil supply, I don't think we realized what a big deal that was, but to Japan, that is like the ultimate threat. Now we have crossed the line and we have become their enemy. And we're like, they look at it like America is literally trying to kill us. They're trying to strangle us to death. And they feel like now we have to do something drastic. Now, Japan never really wanted a war with America. Now, you might think, well, that's weird, because if you know anything about World War II, you know they started the war with us. They bombed Pearl Harbor, which forces America's hand into joining the war. So why the heck would they go bomb Pearl Harbor if they didn't really want a war with America, a long-term war? And they pretty much knew, like, here's another little tidbit for you. I know I'm throwing a lot out at you. By the Japanese High Command's own estimates, they predicted that if there was a long drawn-out war between America and Japan, that there was about a 98% probability that America would win the war. So think about that. They know going into this that this is a really long shot. By their own estimates, they think they have a 98% chance of losing a long drawn-out war with America. Another key fact for you, and put this in here, this will also be on the quiz. Japan has about 1/20th of the industrial capacity of the U.S. Now, I think population-wise, they were about 1/5 of our size at this time, maybe a quarter to a fifth, something like that. So a big population, but not as big as America. But in terms of factories, okay, that's what industrial capacity is. How many places do you have, like Ford Motor Company, that can make a bunch of automobiles? Or you could retool those factories and start making bomber planes and fighter planes and tanks, okay? America has 20 times the industrial capacity. So think about that. For every one aircraft carrier Japan can put out into the ocean. If this is a long-term war and it drags on for a while, because it does take years to make big ships like that, America could put 20 of them out there for every one Japan wins. So if you're the smaller country there, it makes winning a war like that almost impossible in a long drawn out conflict. So they come up with a strategy. Eventually, we're going to get into that they bomb Pearl Harbor, but there's a lot of strategery. For a kind of a made-up word there, there's a lot of strategic thinking going on there, and they don't want a long-term war. They want to go hit us at Pearl Harbor. They want to quickly establish their empire, and then their plan was try to get a peace treaty, try to end the war, try to talk your way out of it. And I think in that respect, they very much underestimated America at the time, because anybody that was going to attack America, that was going to rally the American people, and we would not take that lightly. I think Americans get pretty mad when we get attacked by outsiders, and you get that rally around the flag effect. If you remember back to like Iron-Jawed Angels, it was like if the country's at war against an outside enemy, everybody was expected, you put all your differences aside, you stop protesting and doing all that, and we come together as Americans and we rally together to go defeat that common enemy. All right, I threw a lot of stuff at you. Hopefully that all made sense and you're enjoying kind of the story of the origins of World War II in the Pacific. Tomorrow I'm going to be releasing the final and part 3, which is the final part. And we'll also have a corresponding quiz that'll tie into these 3 chunks of notes we did this week. Take care.